The food and support drop-in started here about 5 years ago, and we've given out now about 30,000 food parcels in the time, and every week we have about 50 volunteers come along. One of the things that we realised was that we really didn't just want to give food. We wanted to be able to offer support to people, and we also wanted to be able to share our heart for the gospel with people. So we felt that we should introduce prayer, and we kicked off a prayer team. And as soon as we started to pray for people, we found that God answered the prayers. One of the challenges that we face with our people is that they have had very chaotic backgrounds, and that when things go wrong, quite often they revert. So particularly alcoholism and drug addiction, they may have been clear of that for a while, but actually when something bad happens, their natural reaction is to either run away from it or to actually go back to the security that they'd had before. And what we needed to teach them was how to actually turn to Jesus in those times and to turn to the community, the Christian community that was supporting them. So finally, just over 18 months ago, in fact nearly 2 years ago now, we, three of us had what we felt was, a real kind of vision from God, which when we put it together became Saturday Gathering. We kind of expected that it might fizzle out because, again, it was a Saturday night and lots of people struggle with giving up time on a Saturday night. And we didn't know whether that would be a time which would be appropriate or inappropriate for our community. We knew that for those of them who were still drinking, then it probably would be inappropriate. It didn't fizzle. It continued to grow, continued to develop. We started with about half a dozen people. We now would have between about 50 and 60 on a Saturday night. And people just come and really enjoy the community and the sense of being part of a family that is Saturday Gathering, which is just beautiful. We'd not been meeting all that long, probably a couple of months. And I heard somebody pick up their mobile phone. They said to the person on the other end, "I can't speak to you just now because I'm at church." And that really concerned me, because we're not keen to become a church in our own right, really for fear that we might start to cut off the support that we'd been getting from other churches. But what did become apparent, and we really knew it as the leadership group right from the beginning, was that we were church because we were members of Christ's body coming together, and we were in fellowship together. As we were trying to work out what God was doing here, one of the things that we did think about was, were we just a stepping stone from here into another church? And as we got to know our people better and the new brothers and sisters that God was bringing to us, and as we started to get to know our local ministers better, we realised that actually that probably wasn't a sensible thing for us to think of ourselves as, because there will be quite a number of people who come to Saturday Gathering who will never make it into another church or another fellowship. They would just find it too difficult and too complex. And for some of them, it might take months and years for them to get to any kind of level of stability, and they may never get there. But they do know that whenever they need us, they can turn up at the door here and they'll always be welcomed in with a hug and a smile, and usually some food as well.
Before I started coming to Saturday Gathering, I couldn't even come out of my house because of crowds. I was that terrified. I was terrified of men because of domestic violence, and it's helped me be comfortable around crowds again, and not just assume that people are going to judge me automatically because of what I've been through, but that people do actually understand.
When I first started coming to the food bank, to say we're a broken man was an understatement. I'd recently lost my partner, left me bringing up 4 children, and a friend said to me that I was drinking, dabbling in drugs. He said, "That won't make you happy." He said, "But Jesus will make you happy." I come to Saturday Gathering where I find time of peace, and people that basically, good people that are down on the luck.
I came here and they made me feel special without wanting money or sex or anything from me. They just wanted to know me for me. The music's lively, they don't care whether you jump around and sing and dance, and you can get involved, and they don't care whether you're alcoholics or drug addicts. They don't care who comes through the doors, you know, they're here to make you feel welcome, and they do a great, fantastic job of it, and I'm proud to be part of this family.
As we were using one of the DVDs one week, we were talking about Jesus and Jesus' baptism. And our people started to say, well, can't we be baptised too? And of course, the answer to that was, well, yes, they could. And again, that was part of our formation because it made us really think about, well, what are we baptising people into in this kind of environment? And Bishop Tony was incredibly helpful to us, and we decided that what we would do is we would baptise and we would confirm. So when we put out the request here to say how many people had come to know Jesus and were wanting now to make a public declaration that they were going to follow him for the rest of their lives, we had 19 people who said that they wanted to be a part of that.
Therefore I ask, do you turn to Jesus?
It was the most glorious of occasions. It was incredibly chaotic. We didn't quite know on the day how many people were going to turn up or not turn up, but they'd all invited friends and family, and we'd got quite a number of people from different churches around and about the area who were really quite excited about what was going on and what was happening. So the whole place was absolutely full and absolutely buzzing. We've seen people move from homelessness into homes. First of all, perhaps into a Christian community that we run, but then from the Christian community out into rented accommodation. And then we've also started to see people now moving into the workplace and being able to hold down jobs. So when you see somebody who's gone on that journey from a place of being homeless, maybe being totally addicted, to being totally chaotic, to then see them move, perhaps through volunteering, and a lot of our volunteers, both at Saturday Gathering and here in the drop-in, come from our guest community and our family community, and learning to be a volunteer helps them then step along the way. We've just done a whole pile of food hygiene courses, and we're doing first aid courses, which our people are just delighted with, because of course that means they can put those on their CVs. And when you go along to the prize givings and just see people with great pride taking these certificates, it just makes it all incredibly worthwhile. A recent development that's come out of our food and support drop-in has been our family gathering, and we believe that that's going to be another fresh expression of church over time. They still get their food parcels, and we make sure that they get all that they need, but also we provide a much more fun time for the children. So today we had the bus there, and that's run by our local Methodists, and the kids can go on and they can play games on the computer and they can do craft activities. But also at the heart of that is Jesus. And so as we're going through the seasons at the moment, we're starting to walk through what the stories of Jesus are. And we believe that over time that will become a worshipping community in its own right. I guess if I could encourage people to get involved, this kind of sharp end is just an amazing place to be. It has its pitfalls, it has its real downsides. But the blessings that are poured out are just amazing. As we step out into those places that God's asked us to move to, when we've seen where he's beginning to move and responded to that move, then he just blesses that abundantly. And I would just encourage you to get involved and to join in. One of my key learnings was coming out of Saturday Gathering was actually I couldn't take what had happened in Saturday Gathering and just immediately apply it into another context, because it doesn't work like that. God creates unique things, not mass production of things. But in terms of thinking about community, I think it's really important, because wherever we are stationed, there are actually gaps in our communities. And part of, I think, what we are called to do is to look to see where those gaps are, and then in finding those gaps to see whether there is a way in which we can we can fill them. So in the whole kind of renewal of all things, finding the extra pieces that fit your context is really important. And you were all very friendly with each other. You very quickly traded pieces because you realised that actually you weren't going to get your jigsaw puzzle done if they didn't get their jigsaw puzzle done. They were just closer to me than you guys, so I couldn't quite see as much as to what was going on over there. But in the real world, that's what happens, isn't it? So actually what built out of Saturday Gathering in Halifax was actually, this win-win relationship with the council, with the police, with other agencies, the homeless agencies and things like that, which meant that we had opportunity to be able to connect with people in a way which was very different to the way in which a person from the council might connect, or a person from the police might connect, or a person. And so we brought the relational stuff in, which meant that actually we could then help the council, the police, homeless agencies achieve what they needed to achieve. Because with us, these guys didn't have suspicion. We were family. And we obviously got to be really careful that we didn't, mess up that relationship. But actually, it was really important. John was just talking to me, John Marsh was just talking to me and saying, one of the things that often happens in these things is you see the kind of peak of the iceberg, which is, this is what we did and this is how we did it. But actually quite often beneath the surface, there's a lot of other stuff that doesn't get talked about that much, about how this all happens. And I think for me, probably one of the important things about the Saturday Gathering experience is that was run totally with volunteers. None of us were paid. I was working full-time still in industry, studying part-time at YMC and doing kind of Saturday Gathering and the other stuff in the whatever marginal time I kind of had. But building the team that supported all of that activity was only about building teams of volunteers. So Kath and Angus, who worked with me, Kath was in school, Kath was a teacher, Angus was still at school. And so, that team was the team that had like the strategy and the vision and the commitment, because actually we felt that what God had done was to give us different parts of that vision. And when we brought it together, the beautiful thing that emerged was Saturday Gathering. But in order to make Saturday Gathering work, we needed lots of other people to help, kind of volunteer with us. And some of those were from the different churches. So some people would see the whole that had been created when it was articulated that this was an opportunity for us to be able to share the good news of Jesus in a very practical way, then actually they began to want to come and be a part of that. And then keeping telling the story of what was going on. And obviously I was quite privileged in that I would often get asked to tell the story. Meant that people kept building faith with it, so that they joined in, and there was that sense of joining in with something that God was doing. It wasn't just serving in a food bank, although, for some of the people there, that was all they did. But that was a very necessary part of actually the whole thing working. And so for me, what I learned in there and what I continue to try and do is to think, well, okay, so where are the bits that are happening? What is the kind of storyline of this? So I'll pick up a little bit more further on, but even like fountains, for our people who are on the margins, they will come to us, first of all, for a meal. And then, we begin to build relationships at that point in time. Then they might go to Renew Wellbeing, which is like our cafe for, I don't know, it's a place where it's okay not to be okay. And so they might come along to that. And then they might decide to kind of be part of our little worship service that happens aside that. In fact, we're baptising our first person from that community week after next. Or they might decide to go to Saturday Gathering, because we have a Saturday Gathering now at Bradford. Or they might connect into church. So there's a whole different range of ways then that people can move from there to there. But right the way from the point they enter, at this point, we're thinking about how we're going to lead this person towards Jesus and building the relationships. And I think when people see that that's what's going on, they're part of a bigger picture, then that becomes part of why I want to volunteer and be a part of this, because it's something that's greater than me. Does that make sense? There's probably lots more that will come out as we go, but I'm going to pick up now about the building communities and just jump into Luke's Gospel. So again, this will be scripture that you're really familiar with. After this, the Lord appointed 72 others and sent them 2 by 2 ahead of him to every town and place where he was about to go. He told them, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few." I guess you guys, like us, are constantly saying that. It's probably our most repeated phrase. "Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. Go. I'm sending you out like lambs among wolves. Do not take a purse or a bag or sandals, and don't greet anyone on the road. But when you enter a house, first say, 'Peace to this house.' If someone promotes peace is there, your peace will rest on them. If not, it will return to you." So that's the first thing. Go and find a place. Take your peace. If someone promotes peace there, then stay. And then stay and be a part of that community. Eat and drink whatever they give you, for the worker deserves his wages. Don't move around all over the place. But when you are welcomed in a town, eat what's offered to you, heal the sick, and then tell them the kingdom of God has come near. So I think it's quite simple in scriptural terms, but obviously more complex when we try to work it out on the ground. But it's this sense of go and be a part of community, be properly a part of community. And often when I'm working with my teams, I have to keep reminding them that actually our Saturday gathering team, we are not the Saturday gathering leaders who are doing this to a Saturday gathering community. We have to become a part of that community. You can't sit on the outside of it. You have to be right in the middle of it. And I think that was what was really helpful. And again, learning from Saturday gathering in Halifax experience was that I was really accepted as part of that community. You know, they saw me as being, their leader, but I was in it with them. It was, I was part of it. It wasn't that I was stood outside going, what you need to do is this. And that's, it's really quite a significant attitudinal change, I think, for us, and probably where sometimes as church we get it wrong, because we think what we're going to do is to do it to somebody, but actually we need to be a complete part of the community. And it's only once you've done that actually you earn the right to get to the point of praying with and for people, seeing the kingdom of God come and then telling them about the message of Jesus. And again, I think sometimes we get it all in the wrong order, because what we want to do is to tell them about the kingdom of Jesus, and then for them to join in what we're doing. And it just doesn't, in my experience, it just doesn't work in that kind of way. So many of you have seen this. It always resurfaces at the time of Christmas. It's like, what's wrong, Jesus? You said you wanted a church for your birthday. Yeah, I did, but I'm having trouble getting it out of the box. Now, going back a while, I would have probably said some stuff around, one of the things that our ancestors didn't do us any favours in was to providing us with church buildings. But then God gave me a church with no church building for a year and a half, 2 years. So I've changed my views somewhat on that. So it is useful to have a church building. But I think the danger is that we become entrenched in the building, and that actually everybody's got to kind of come to us rather than to be out there and to be thinking about what is appropriate for our culture. So Ed Silvoso is one of the people that has shaped my thinking a little bit around this. And I love this quote. So we'll just go through it a little bit slow because it's a lot of words. But he says that when the moment came to introduce his transformational agency, i.e. the church, Jesus didn't select either the two agencies that were in play at the time. The two agencies were the temple, which had the presence of God in the Ark of the Covenant, and the synagogue, which was where the word of God was taught. So he didn't choose either one of those as being his transformational agency. He announced that he would build his ecclesia, and he used a term that in the Roman Empire in general and also in Israel described a governmental institution, so not a sacred institution. The Lord didn't discard everything that went on in the temple or the synagogue, but he assimilated significant components from both those institutions into his ecclesia. So from the temple, he kept the indwelling presence of God, and from the synagogue, the central role of the scriptures and the fellowship of its members. But where the temple and the synagogue differ with Jesus' ecclesia, however, is in the areas of constitution, location, and mobility. The temple and the synagogues were static institutions that functioned in the buildings that members had to go to on specified occasions, whereas the ecclesia was a buildingless mobile people movement designed to operate 24/7 in the marketplace for the purpose of having an impact on everybody and everything. It's really powerful, isn't it? In terms of, thinking about where we are. Jesus wasn't chucking away what was gone, but he was basically saying, this kingdom of God that I'm speaking about, it's not going to be static. It's going to be mobile, and therefore the terminology that's used, the ecclesia, the called out ones, this whole sense of government institution is something which is mobile and movable rather than completely static. We have to be looking differently at things. We can't just do what's always gone before. We have to be thinking about, so what else is out there? What else is there in my community? Where else can I begin to connect with different communities? So having done Saturday Gathering, I continued to do Saturday Gathering through my curacy. And at the back end of my curacy, I was given a church to look after as well. So that was really kind of normal parish church ministry in a suburban village in Halifax, Siddle, for those of you who know Halifax. And so that gave me a different opportunity to really think about what does it mean to be a priest in a suburban community, and how do you start and think about not only managing a church which was 12 maybe on a Sunday, mainly elderly people. I did take 2 or 3 Saturday Gathering people across with me. But how do you manage that? One, how do you begin to grow that? But also, how do you think about reaching all of the people in a suburban village who don't yet know Jesus? So I found my way into school, which was great fun. So I hadn't really done kind of much school ministry before. Andrew there is one of the guys who moved across from Saturday Gathering with me. And so we started out initially doing worship, just normal kind of gathered worship. My dog provided an ideal way in with this school. It's interesting, isn't it, how little things happen. So I was doing collective worship on a regular basis. One particular day, wanted to talk about the environment and thought, how am I going to present this? My dog and I would walk around the village all the time. The village was always littered. We had a big council estate, lots of glass and stuff on the floor. So I thought, I'll take the dog in, phone the head. Is it okay to bring the dog in? Yes, it's fine, bring the dog in. So took the dog in, was never allowed back then without the dog. The dog had to come every single time. And somehow, again, it's just interesting, isn't it, how God uses these things. So kids got very attached to the dog, and the teachers got very attached to the dog. And I think when we left, they weren't worried about me going, they were more worried about the fact that Dougal was going. But from those discussions and dialogue came the opportunity to, first of all, do an after-school club and then to do an after-school church. And so this developed, and of course you can't take many photographs in school, can you? So these are about all the ones that I can do. This was a Easter experience that we did. That was Diary of a Disciple that we did. By the time I left, the kids could tell you the good news of Jesus in their own kind of language, because we'd gone over it that many times, whether it was Christingle, whether it was Easter experience, whether it was, in the smaller groups that we had. Parents started coming along to the church, in the school, and to be honest, that was just another way of kind of embedding. Now, it was really interesting in terms of, we talked about the impact on the church, the mother church. So my old people could not understand that this was church. They were like, why aren't you're doing all this stuff? And they knew that I was doing it because I was telling them, keep telling the stories. But it was like, but that's not church. In order to be church, they need to come into church. So, but if they come into church, we're going to give them a normal communion service, and you're not going to be happy because they're going to be running about because they're children, and it's going to cause mayhem, and but all the time. And they hated. We had a real ministry of kind of baptisms and the pastoral services. But when we did the baptisms, the church was full of often scantily clad people who weren't married but had children who wanted to be baptised, and it was chaos and they hated it. It was like, can't you take these outside of a normal church service and do it at a different time because we actually don't want these people here? And it's like, no, we can't. So trying to bring those two together was a real kind of challenge. I have to say I didn't manage to do it. The church is about to close. It's really sad, but I used to take as many pictures of crafts and stuff like that we were doing. We plastered one wall, covered it with all of the different activities to try to show that actually this was where we were impacting the community. And, I still get messages from the head teacher of the school who kind of knew Jesus, but wasn't quite over the line, I don't think, but, was very, very respectful. She'll still message me and ask me to pray for her for different things, so it's really interesting, isn't it? So, whatever the context is that you are in, there's a way in which you can really feed into the community. There was a gap there, and that gap I reached out, and in the reaching out, you gradually begin to move towards the ability to influence the life and lives of those children. I don't think those children will ever forget. When I came into Bradford, one of the first people that I connected with, she'd have been about 19. She'd just come into church. She'd come to church for the first time. And I've got another couple who it's very similar. And she came because she heard the good news of Jesus at school and wanted to be able to take that faith further. No faith background at all. Another couple, the couple that I was just referring to, I baptised them a few months ago, and they'd rung me up and said, I really want to come to church. What do I know? What do I need to know? And it's like, well, just come. And they're a lovely young couple, but from challenging backgrounds. And she said, I want to come because I know my grandma has always prayed for me. And he said he'd been really taken by assemblies in school. And so completely out of the blue, this couple had turned up and come along. So, again, probably some of you are in that place where you're sowing into this stuff all the time and thinking, will it ever go anywhere? And I think the reality is it does. God's placing markers on these children. His Holy Spirit is there and he's working with them, and, they will draw on. And it's a way, again, in which we can influence and change our communities, not just for now, but also for the future. So just going back to Ed Sylvester, he said, transformation is a process. It's like the feeble light at the crack of dawn. It's meant to grow brighter and brighter, but the dawn does not happen and the path remains untravelled until one begins to take steps of obedience in the right direction. And again, this has often been my kind of experience of God. You see something, there's a glimmer, and you don't know whether it's God or not. I'm not always that great at interpreting, but the way that you find out, by and large, is taking those first steps. And when you take those first steps, you get that sense of, is this of God or not? I think that might be kind of me drawing to a close in terms of this session. So, any questions that you'd like to ask me about this section?
I'm thinking about the school, Linda. Was that a church school? Or
No, it wasn't a school.
If you encountered any resistance in coming in?
No, I didn't experience any resistance at all. It was just a completely open door. I messaged them literally as I found out I was moving to the area, and said, would love to come and talk to you about, how I might help. And I think that's often the thing, is it's like, how can I help? Is there anything, is there a gap that I can fill? You know, back to your jigsaw puzzles, is there something there that I can offer, that we can offer? And they were like, yeah, come in and do collective worship. And then it just was an ever increasing open door from there. It's just, and you'll know this stuff, it's just all relational. It's being there, being willing to commit, being faithful, being very supportive of them. So if something was written on social media anti them, I would write words of support and encouragement. It's all of those things.
And sorry, how frequently did you?
It's in school. I was in weekly. Yeah. Every week for assembly, and then every week for church. Yeah.
And parents, did you say?
Yeah. Not always many. They were much more keen for their children to be in church than for them to be in church. But then again, some were working, so it was like 4 o'clock in the after 4 or 4:30. I don't know. It was end of school time was when it happened. So.
And that's really encouraging to kind of hear the building on foundations that the team that I've been a part of.
Yeah, absolutely.
Walpole, who was a reader at the time, now is ordained.
Yeah.
He set up a lot of those, worked to set up a lot of those relationships with the school, so that the open door that you got was the open door that Neil and others in the team
it's really, I agree.
It's kind of that we're never... It can feel as if we're starting from zero.
Yeah.
But God has always been at work. And
exactly so.
To me, actually, because that's 23 years ago.
Yeah.
Such an encouragement, even if the church is still in the same place as the church.
Yeah.
Actually, kind of the foundations that we laid in relationship to the school and the community are still happening. So it's a real encouragement.
Yeah. I mean, again, it was really disappointing when I moved out that they didn't think about what to do next with the church. And again, it's this kind of whole idea of succession planning, so kind of thinking ahead as to what's going to happen when you go. Now, I wasn't in a position to do that at that point in time. I was a curate. It wasn't my role to do it. But, that then moved into a period of, it fell under the Minster, and the Minster has a slightly different approach to the way in which things are done. And so... there's a reader, and Andrew is still there, and there's a couple of others who are still there, but they've not been able to hold it together without the oversight. Again, it's this oversight role, isn't it? Had there been somebody there who was continuing to cheer them on and was prepared to really help them to invest further, that area, I mean, again, it really grieves me, because I look at it and I go, it is so ripe, it's so ripe. It was so easy, kind of sharing with people the good news of Jesus. But what they needed really was to be able to grow and be discipled, and then, and rather than continuing what had started, because you kind of do I don't know, it's the sowing of the seed, isn't it? And God watering. But if there isn't anybody there then to tend and to begin to move it forward, then it just dies. And I totally believe that at some point there will be something else revolutionary that happens in Siddle, because they just are so, open to the good news of Jesus. It's basically a white working class community for whom the parish church has been really important. And so, just needs somebody to go in and tend.
Can you say a little bit more about discerning the story and speaking out the story so that people feel they can be part of it? How did you do that? How did you do that discernment?
So it was a little bit like that Ed Silvestro statement. So I'm one of those people, my curate who's just moved on now to the cathedral would say, Linda, I'd be talking to him and he'd just go, but you always see an opportunity to do something else, and you always see an opportunity to plant. So for me, I'm always looking around and seeing that where there is opportunity in my head always is there's a worshipping community in that. So, so that is part of my psyche, and what I have to do is often to hold back on that and go, actually, which of these opportunities is it that God is giving?
In the midst of it, how do you discern what God's doing in the midst of it and be able to speak that story out to people?
So like when I was in the school, how would I speak that story out?
Back a bit more, I don't know where I said. It was when you first started about building communities, and you said that you were constantly having opportunities to tell people the story.
Yeah.
And then they felt that they wanted to be part of that.
Yes.
Picture.
Yeah. So that was kind of out of Saturday gathering, and there, because we were beginning to see the early signs of God at work, whether I would just use the opportunity whenever I was offered it to be able to tell that story. So it might have been in my own church, my sending church that I was a part of. And then you tend to find then that somebody else will say, well, would you come and share that story over here? And would you come and share that story over there? And it's the power of testimony, isn't it? Yeah. You know, it's that sense of, you know, once you have shared that kind of story, then it builds confidence in other people to say, actually, maybe I could do that, because actually none of this stuff is difficult. You know, none of it takes a degree in theology or being ordained or any of that stuff, most of it anyway, you know, and it's just that kind of sharing of the practical steps, which is always why I try to make sure, and obviously I'm gearing this talk to you guys who know a lot of this stuff anyway, but you know, if I'm talking elsewhere, then I'll often talk about the failures that there were along the way, because again, I think that's really important. There's lots of points at which I've failed, we've failed, it's failed along the way, and that also, in vocalising the fact that there's failures, that actually helps people think, well, I could try, because actually failing's not a bad option. So, you know, all of the journey I'm telling you about today, everyone, there's significant learning points that hopefully mean that now I'm doing this role, I'm not going to make those same mistakes along the way. I probably will make some of them because I'm human, very human, and but. Yeah, it's that sense that actually there's stuff there that if we had done differently, if we'd done better, then it would have changed perhaps some of the outcomes.
But the main thing is looking for signs of God at work and speaking out.
Yeah, I think just being really, really open. I mean, you know, we'll come on to the wrestling stuff in a minute, but, you know, I had just been appointed to Bradford, and this guy messages me and says, I'd like to talk to you about using wrestling at church. And you go, well, probably exactly the same as you're all thinking. Well, what on earth would that mean? I've got absolutely no flipping idea. And, you know, you join somebody for coffee, and in that I'm discerning, actually, this isn't just about using wrestling as an evangelistic opportunity, but actually there's potential here for us to reach a community that would never normally step over the threshold of a church. I have to hold myself back. We've got this static caravan in Skipsea. Bradford's one of those places where you have to escape from every now and again, otherwise you just would never rest. So, you know, one of my coping mechanisms was to buy this caravan. My husband's also in decline, really. So it just gave us an opportunity to go. But every time I go, I should be doing church here. It would be so easy. Yeah, it would be so easy to start a worshipping community here, and you know, and I have to go, Lord, is this in your plan? I keep hearing, no, it's not. So, because that's my place of rest, not my place of going to do another church.
In the Christian version of wrestling, do the wrestlers have to stop pretending?
I'll come to that later, because that will spoil one of the strap lines if I tell you now. But I will come to it.
Linda, at the beginning of each of the stories, you've always said we decided to do this, we decided to do that.
Yeah.
So who have the we tended to be?
It's really good. So it depends really on the context. So the we in Saturday Gathering was myself and Kath and Angus, because we kind of led that. The we in this context, in this kind of Siddle context, was me, my training incumbent, because I had 2 training incumbents, and the PCCs. And so, you know, the normal kind of authority stuff. When it comes on to fountains, then it's me, my board of trustees, again, the senior team. So sometimes, like, just to think, wrestling, sometimes I've got it alone a little bit. So sometimes it's probably been more of a me beginning to forage away in with God, but because I've felt something, and then once you've kind of gone those first couple of steps, because the danger is if you get consensus of opinion before you step out on something, then often that will prevent you from going any further, because, you know, I can't tell you the number of risks there are about wrestling. You know, yesterday I was sanctioning the fact that, or I was praising the fact that our builders had made really good a wrestler-shaped hole that was in the side of our sanctuary wall. So, you know, there's plenty of reasons why you wouldn't do these things, and sometimes I think it's just a matter of judgment as to it's that saying, isn't it, about don't ask my permission if you don't want the answer no. So sometimes you've just had to kind of go with it and then kind of get the backup afterwards. So combination of all of those things really, rather than one specific, contextual. So this is kind of now moving into probably my more recent kind of stuff, and so growing leaders is probably the mainstay actually of what I do. So I'm going to show you a little bit of video that gives you a context to Fountains Church Bradford. So we're a resource church. We've been invested in quite heavily by the Strategic Development Fund, which is awesome, but comes with many challenges as well. And the video that I'm going to show you, in fact, I'll do scripture first and then I'll show you the video. So this really is the scripture that has characterized these last kind of 4 years for me. So it's Fountains will be 4 in September. And as we were preparing for Fountains, this was actually part of the morning prayer. I can never remember quite what they're called, canticles maybe, it was a canticle, I don't know, that was being used, and it's really kind of shaped my thinking and our thinking over the course of the last 4 years. God keeps calling us back to this scripture. You probably wouldn't be surprised how many people come up and go, I've got a scripture for you, Linda. It's Isaiah 43. And you go, oh, great. Here we go again. Do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I've summoned you by name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burnt, and the flames will not set you ablaze. That should have alarmed me, actually, because all of those things have happened. But then he goes on, Isaiah, forget the former things, don't dwell on the past. And I don't think that means don't forget the past, because some translations read it as that. I think it's don't dwell on the past. Use the learning that you've had from the past. But look, I'm doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I'm making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland. So that is the dream really for Fountains. Some of you will know we are city centre. We part of what Bradford Council did a few years ago to change the nature of the city centre was to create a lovely reflection pool, which is full of fountains. I think it's got the biggest fountain in Europe in the middle of it. It's a real place of gathering during nice sunny weather, and a real space of kind of open heaven. And so that is again part of our visioning for what Fountains is, that we believe is from God. Hello, my name's Linda Maslen, and I'm the leader here at Fountains Church Bradford. Welcome to our building, which you wouldn't believe perhaps was actually originally nightclub buildings. At times there was 3 or 4 nightclubs here. By the time we got to the point of buying the building, unfortunately it had been turned into just such a messy state. There were lots of drugs paraphernalia, all of the lighting and heating had been wrecked out. Anything that could have been sold was sold. And so this was really quite a dark space. We know that drugs were run from here. We know that arms were run from here. We even know that people were trafficked from here. And all the time that we were going through the process of buying the building, negotiating with the council over lease, we prayed that there would be a time when we would start and see the people who had been damaged by this building coming into a place of light, being healed, and coming into a living relationship with Jesus. And I'm really delighted that we are beginning to see some of those things taking place now. Well, it's been quite a journey. So as we started out 3 years ago, and we didn't have anybody who was really our congregation, we had to start right from square one with a group of people who initially gathered together to pray, and then gradually we moved into Sunday worship. We didn't have a building, so eventually we got the building that we're in now. And over the 3 years, we've been doing up that building in phases. We're about halfway through. So it's turned into quite an exciting space. You can see the auditorium behind us, and we've got a cafe, and we've got another area which we call the hub, where all sorts of our children's activities happen, and the work that we do with those who are suffering from mental health illnesses and things like that takes place. So as I said, our congregation started off really small, and now on a Sunday we get up to about 100 people in our congregation. But we've also got other congregations that have started here as well. So we've got a wrestling church, which everybody always raises their eyebrows at. We've had 3 of those now where what we're doing is using professional wrestling. So that's a little bit like pantomime. It's all about telling stories to tell the good news of Jesus. And in that, we've seen people coming to faith, and we've had 2 baptism services. We've also got a fresh expression of church called Saturday Gathering, which is where we've been working with people who perhaps have had really, really challenging backgrounds, and they're the people who might spend a lot of time out on the streets for whatever reason. They come together and we have food, and again, we tell the gospel stories in really simple ways. So our community kitchen was probably one of the first things to get going here, because obviously the 3 years that we've been running as a church, 2 of those years, we've been in COVID. And one of the first things that we were able to do actually was to start to provide food for people in the community. And initially we did that by serving takeaway food that people could take away. And then gradually people could come into the kitchen and find community around the tables, which has been really fun. We began to build relationships as well. We're a city centre church, so we have lots of connections with the police, with the housing association, those who do housing outreach on the streets, the Department of Work and Pensions doing benefits, all sorts of agencies. And as we connected with them, they asked us whether actually they could use our kitchen as a means to draw people together, to provide a one-stop shop for support. So for some of the people that we have been working with, it's really quite challenging if they've got to go, first of all, to housing, and then they've got to go to DWP to talk about their benefits, and then they might have to go somewhere else to talk about their health. And what we've done is on a Thursday, we gather together all of those great agencies. They come to one spot, and then our people can come along and have food, and at the same time deal with whatever the issues are that they have at that moment in time.
The Church of England's idea of a resource church is not to create a shiny church, as some people might call it. The House of Bishops, in their statement on church planting, that said that church plants that aspire to become resource churches must have a clear mission, strategy, and must have a clear plan for planting. So Fountains Church was planted to become one of a network of churches across the city. We already have a network of churches in the Diocese of Leeds, in the Bradford Episcopal area. So Fountains was planted to help to address some of the areas that those churches weren't reaching, especially city centre ministry and young adults. So the hope is that Fountains Church will become a strong city centre church with a strong young congregation, that, as is the case with city centres, as young people come in and then move out, that the Fountains Church congregation will be a resource to the churches that are around the city. So that might take the form of different partnerships. So the first one of these has been with St Margaret's Freising Hall. Nathaniel Poole, our associate leader, has now spends half of his time in Freising Hall, and that is one expression of how a church that is called to be a resource church, such as Fountains, can become a resource church through an intentional missional strategy. It's very tempting to think that resource churches, or shiny churches as I've said, have got it all sussed. We tend to be quite good at front presenting things. Our social media feeds tend to be quite good. Our live streaming of services tends to be quite good. But if you scratch below the surface, you'll realise that we don't actually have the depths of maturity that many existing churches have. So one way in which our partnership with St Margaret's Freising Hall has become mutual, in that we've been receiving wisdom from some of the leadership team at St Margaret's Freising Hall, especially recently in the form of financial advice, as we learn to adapt and to put in place the systems that we need to be the sort of organisation that we're becoming.
So that is kind of our background and our context. And as I move from Siddle into Fountains, I spent kind of 3 months on and off with Lizzie Wolfe at St George's, Leeds. Many of you will know Lizzie, really because I guess the senior leadership wanted me to find out what it would be like leading a church which was very different to Siddle. So, you know, Siddle, I was the only person in the area, really. Fountains was going to be very, very different to that. And one of the key things that I learned from Lizzie was just how much time she invested in people. And I think that's been a really good kind of learning point for me. And if you look at my diary now, more so probably than the last 4 years, the biggest bulk of my time is spent with my team and with my team of volunteers. And so whereas in the past, most of my stuff has been getting involved in the relationships, kind of in the different worshipping communities, what I'm needing to do now is to step back from that and enable others to build those relationships and to lead that kind of team. Now, Fountains is an ever increasingly complex kind of organisation. As I went into it, it was very interesting in that my role was, I guess, kind of to some degree threefold, and not a lot of vicaring took place. A lot of it was about organisation and getting infrastructure in place, processes, procedures, and massive building work. You know, that was kind of what you saw there was kind of, I don't know, it was a couple of £1 million worth of building work. It literally was strip everything out that had been there because there was nothing that was functional that was left in the building, and then have it all redone. So, and then on top of that, they'd kind of normal pastoral vicaring of a community, worshipping community that was very, very young and, you know, needed to develop. And, you know, our mechanism up front was people would come to church one Sunday, and by the third Sunday, they were on a volunteering team because there was no way that we could manage otherwise. But probably like, you know, many of you, COVID changed a whole pile of that stuff. And, you know, just the same way probably many of you are struggling for volunteers to serve and to support you, we are too, because people don't want to tie up to rotas. They just don't want to be, you know, asked to do stuff on a regular basis. And so that's, you know, that's kind of quite a challenge. What we've done though, I mean, you probably will have heard and seen resonances of what I said in that video that link back to almost where I'd started in the kind of whole Saturday gathering space. You can see the replication. Now, in terms of size and scale, Halifax is 1/10 of the size of Bradford. So, you know, it's very kind of small population numbers compared to where we are now. And I quite quickly had to learn that there was a far greater amount of complexity in leading in Bradford than there was in Halifax. You know, you'll know some of them. You know, we have very significant kind of number of people who are Muslim. That's by far the biggest religion in our city, and we have to be really careful about how we work with our Islamic neighbours. Our university, many resource churches are planted in a university city, and we are a university city, but I would say it's maybe changed slightly this year, so I just need to be careful around my numbers, but this year, I would have said probably 80% of the students in our university would be home students. They don't come from anywhere else. And of that, a good 80% of them would be Muslim. So we haven't been able to do like some of the other resource churches have done and go straight for the universities and get all the young people out of there, because if we did that, well, probably I would have a price on my head. You know, that is the way it is. I came in just as one of the free churches had baptised a Muslim in a bath, and it had gone, you know, wild on social media, and our bishop had to intercede for this guy because there was a price on his head. They took him out of Bradford for a while before he came back after some very careful negotiations had been done. So, you know, that's again a very challenging context for us to be operating in. But some of the key things that I'd learned in terms of, you know, my journey so far had meant that as we started to think about the different areas of our church that began to emerge and developed, that actually some of those would become kind of worshipping communities in their own right. So having seen that we needed to start with, just because of the way COVID was, giving out food, although originally a Saturday gathering was very much in our strategic plan, our hope was that would have been further downstream, and we would have been able to really go and find people who were young professionals and young families and draw them into the church first and foremost. Because of the nature of COVID, we weren't able to do that. Our city centre really only began to recover the back end of last year. So, there was no point me going and wandering around the city square and stuff, because actually a lot of people hadn't returned to work. So we just went again where the Spirit seemed to be leading and stepped into that space. So this is just a really quick view of what our governance kind of looks like at the moment. Now, in just the same way as I had the challenges at Siddle with the older people, I don't have a lot of older people in my church, and it's a very balanced demographic. But they still have difficulty in terms of thinking about other things as being worshipping communities or church. It's like I had this bizarre conversation with my trustees at one point, and you suddenly realise that actually, our thinking's like miles ahead sometimes of everybody else. But it was like, well, how can Saturday Gathering be a church in its own right? Because they don't give. They're not good, because I was saying actually we need to have some representation, our trustee board, from these different communities, and they were saying, well, they haven't earned the right for that, basically, because they don't give. It's like, oh, okay. What's the difference between, Saturday Gathering being classed as a worshipping community in a church isn't my small group? And they said, well, actually, your small group could, but you'd need to be much more missional. So you'd need to be reaching other people for Jesus, not just sitting around. Anyway, but it's a difficult thing for people to get your head around, isn't it? And it takes me back to, when the DDO said to me about, pioneering, and I couldn't get my head around it because it was too far foreign from where I was. So that's gradually building now into our kind of governance strategy, and each of these are on a different kind of journey. So it's interesting, our Stay and Play, which is our kind of toddler group, that has a little worship time at the end of it. Probably many of yours do too. But what we're seeing is, very interestingly, quite a lot of Muslim women are coming into that, and they don't have to go to the worship, it's set aside, but they're choosing to come into the worship and have some really good and interesting discussions. So I can see that beginning to emerge. And even since I did this, which was just a few months ago, Bradford University has just had a load of international students arrive, particularly from Nigeria. I don't know whether Sheffield is the same, but when I spoke to the Chancellor of the university, because I was like, wow, what's happened? Suddenly my church has become much more multicultural, which is, of course, what I want. But what's driven this? And she is saying that they think it's kind of a byproduct of COVID. So lots of people had applied for university places from Nigeria during COVID, and then everything was obviously put on hold. And now suddenly they're all coming. But in that time, whereas before, maybe 50% of the people who applied would actually make it into the city, this last year, 95% of the people who applied have come. So they're really struggling from a variety of perspectives. And probably worth just saying that the relationship that we already have with places like the university mean that actually she rang up, did the university chancellor, and said to me, we've got this problem. You said that you'd love to work with us on where there are problems that you might be able to help fix. Would you like to set up a nursery for us? So that was one where I immediately said, no, I've had experience of that before. Not a chance. But I do know a church that's doing it, so maybe you could go and talk to them. So that's that. Now, you probably heard Pete say on there, so Pete, he was my curate, he's gone now, he's gone to the Bradford Cathedral, about St Margaret's. We now have a second network church as well, so I have 2 associates who are part-time with us and part-time with another church, and so that's kind of part of our fountain. So, kind of helping and supporting. Neither of those churches are dead churches or were dead churches. They had life in them but have lost their missional framework and context. And so what we're trying to do is to work with those communities to rebuild the missional edge and to grow the churches. And I envisage that probably those 2, so Chris and Nathaniel, will probably be in those churches for around 3 years. And then my prayer is that they'll come back and we'll be able to plant them into another church to replicate the same thing. Been really important for me, having watched the Resource Church thing and always said that I would never actually be a Resource Church leader. Never say never to God. There's been another learning out of the back of all of this. Was that we would be very much a part of the infrastructure and the churches of Bradford, not, you've had all of this money invested in you, and therefore you become the be all and end all of it. So I liked the plan that our senior team had come up with, and again, Pete referred to it, which is a plan of a resource church and a number of resourcing churches. So we work very closely together in that network. We are in the inner Bradford deanery, so there's a plan for how we reach all of the different areas of the city. And in doing that, certainly Pete and I, before last year, were always in another church on a Sunday morning. So we meet at 4:30 in a Sunday afternoon, which means that we can support other churches at 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning, or 10:30 or 11 or whatever. And my reason really for doing that was to make sure that we didn't end up in a situation where people could just go, well, you've got all the money and all the people, and basically put your arms around it. So churches that were in interregnum, or churches where the vicars needed a holiday, or any of those things, that was how we would respond to that. Julie?
Quick question while we're on government. You talked about a board of trustees.
Yeah.
Are you established under a BMO?
Yeah. So we're established under a BMO, and we started out with a board of trustees that was basically the church leaders and the bishop, the diocesan secretary and the archdeacon. And then over time, we've begun to grow that. So we currently have 12 members on our board, and essentially we are morphing towards a PCC model, but just recognising that that takes time. Pete talked about the fact that, you know, it may look all shiny on the top, but actually underneath it, there's still quite a lot of learning to do. It's very, very new. We had a half day away with our trustees last week, and it was the first time for me it felt like we were beginning to function as a trustee board, and we're kind of like 3 years down the track, because people don't really know what's expected and what's known. So at some point we'll do that. We don't have wardens at the moment. We have an aspiration that by this time next year we'll have been able to grow some wardens within our community. So yeah.
Just off the back of that, is it an elected body or is it?
Yes, yeah, it's elected body. So we call it a missional role rather than an electoral role. And our constitution basically says how many members we can have how many on the trustee board we can have according to how many members we have, and so on and so forth. And in all of this, as I say, my challenge has been to try to make sure, particularly this year, less so last year, but with Saturday Gathering and Wrestling Church really kind of gathering strength, that those membership reflects the different worshipping communities and not just the 4:30 community. And, you know, that has caused a little bit of tension along the way. So in all of those now, just looking across to make sure that I'm not going to tell you something that isn't true. I have a much lesser role than I would have done in previous kind of existence, because what we've been doing is really looking to make sure that we are building leadership teams that can take these forward. And I was just sharing with somebody around Saturday Gathering at the moment. I'm finding that really quite frustrating because I know because you're part of that community, and the same thing has happened in Bradford as it did in Halifax. So, very much a part of that community, and, very much in growing it, because I was part of growing it. And then I've got a new associate, Chris, who's absolutely amazing. And Chris is beginning to take on Saturday Gathering. And that's really good, and that's intentional, but it's still really hard to let it go. And it's also really hard to know, how far do I try to influence how he does things, because he's not going to do them the same way as I do. How far do I try and influence him to do it in a similar way to me? And how far do I just allow him to, kind of go with it? And we've just got to the stage where I also need to try to help those who are in the leadership community on it. It's about 17 people who are really committed to Saturday Gathering, who I would say are, kind of that. There's 3 who are kind of real leaders alongside Chris, and then, there's a group who are very, very involved. They're in there at least every alternate week. How do I enable them to turn more towards Chris and less towards me, particularly when, you know, trouble happens. So there was a little skirmish on Saturday night, and immediately I was getting the messages. It's like, but Chris is there, you know, go talk to Chris about it. So, you know, these are hard things, aren't they? I mean, you know, those of you who are moving from kind of being ministering to doing oversight, you know, our natural reaction for a lot of us is to want to be in there getting our hands dirty, and we feel a little bit like, as if we're not doing the right thing if we don't get our hands dirty and are trying to, trying to point. And I guess with all of them, it's knowing that point at which some have set up and have had none of my involvement at all. Stay and Play, the international student community. I've not been involved in those. You know, they've just grown up around the people, and that's, you know, that to some degree that's kind of easier to happen. Wrestling Church has been somewhat different. So obviously Wrestling Church, I'll talk to you a little bit about that now. Wrestling Church emerged out of this conversation that I had with Gareth around wrestling. And initially we were thinking it was just going to be like an evangelistic thing. So I'm not expecting that you'll know much about pro wrestling. I now know more than I did before, but certainly not everything. But it is kind of a pantomime type situation. So the guys, you know, will work out a storyline. There's a plan. You know, we have almost a plan for the next year of our things. We alternate between a performance and a church. So, but in the performance, we will point towards the church, and all of the performances have storylines that you would probably recognise that come from the Bible, and it's all about good and evil, and good overcoming evil. And so, you know, we started out on this kind of journey. I guess, again, it was between Gareth and myself, actually, having conversations and saying, there's perhaps more than just it being evangelistic. Maybe this is a community, again, who you wouldn't see come over the doorway normally in a church. And ours doesn't look like it. You can see when the wrestling rings up, it looks like I don't know, anything. But they would come in, and then we've got the opportunity, not immediately to kind of do a big gospel message and have everybody repent and come to Jesus, but to start that building of relationships that takes them on that journey. And so by having the performance and then the church and then the performance and then the church, by and large, the number of people is remaining pretty constant. And so the message is building and growing. And as we started out, the thing that really surprised me was probably, I think, the first wrestling church we did have some baptisms, because there was already some people who'd come to know Jesus through the wrestling performances that we did before we brought in the church, if that makes sense. And somebody came up to me afterwards and just said, do you know, I've always wanted to be baptised. Never knew that I could be baptised. I said, that interesting. You know, so for me, you know, it's again back to what we're trying to do is to make God possible for people who think that God isn't interested in them, or God's, you know, right over here and, you know, they're right over here and there's such a big gulf that they can't make it. So if you want to get the full lowdown, then there is a BBC documentary, which, as I said, I got a little bit of flack over because of pride, that talks about the way that we set up the church and how it's working. The model is really that we have a training school that meets weekly, and there's always one or other of us at the training school to be there to talk and just build relationships. They train. It's cheap for them to be able to train the wrestlers. It's safe for them to be able to train, and often this is not the case, and, you know, kind of other places. But we have weekly connection with these guys that ultimately, as they get better, they're able to be part of the performances or part of the wrestling church. So that's the kind of direction of travel with these guys. So again, it's that same thing around building relationships and allowing them to develop. So somebody asked the question about, you know, what about, does it mean that they don't tell stories anymore? Was that the question about the wrestlers?
Oh, yeah.
So they do, it is still, but they retell the stories. But what we found is, again, that journeys have shifted and changed. So in a wrestling match, you are either a heel or a face. And a heel is the baddie and a face is the goodie. And right at the beginning, we had a guy, Jack, who's one of our wrestlers, and he was always the baddie. He was right from the very beginning, and he and I had some real contretemps over stuff, all very public, of course, but he cheated, and then he dissed women. And so, you know, we had all of these kind of debates that were going on in and around the wrestling matches and the wrestling teams. The challenge was that Jack then became a Christian and came to know Jesus, which is totally amazing. Oh, I should also say that he was Jack is Salford, so Lancashire, and of course we are proudly Yorkshire and Bradford. So there was also this, and I mean, there is massive kind of excitement in crowds over all this stuff. I mean, if ever you wanted to know how the crowds turned from crucify him hit on from a heroin on Palm Sunday to crucify him on Sunday, the wrestling crowds are an exact example of this stuff, but they get very, very excited about it. So we then had to change the long-term storyline because Jack couldn't be a Christian. He wanted to be baptized, so we couldn't have him as a Christian, have him baptized and have him continue to be the baddie. So we had to do a big turn face of stuff, which was how I ended up in the wrestling ring. So this is... This is one of the joys of kind of getting involved in the community. So this is me as Princess Warrior, which is my my wrestling name, and probably at the point where I just about did my ankle in, because jumping off those ropes is actually quite impactful, I discovered after the events. But the guys are really good in helping and supporting. So I go on to tell them about Jesus. You know that stuff. So this was our first batch of people who were baptized. A few weeks ago, we had our first confirmations. I think we've got about 15 people who've come to faith through Wrestling Church now. And so Bishop Toby came. He's now known as the Big T. Nobody escapes. He really entered into it very, very well. I was saying to the guys, listen, I don't know how Bishop Toby's going to be, so you're just going to have to go gently and just go wherever. And literally his music played with his big T flashing across, because we all have our video entry music and all of that kind of stuff. And he basically got his crook and galloped across the stage and then galloped back again and then threw himself into the ring and stomped his crook on the ground. And and he spoke to these guys incredibly well as he confirmed them. It was really appropriate kind of response for him. So just in terms of our development of leadership around this, and also I was questioned about discipleship earlier. So this was something which was really on my heart as we started out, because the challenge of Wrestling Church is that that ring takes 2.5 hours to put up and 2.5 hours to take down. So it's not something you can do on a day-to-day basis, and we don't have a separate space that we can put it in. So I had to think about, how then are we going to develop these disciples of Jesus and do so in a way that's appropriate to them, but doesn't require us to have the wrestling ring out twice a week. And so we have a small group, particularly for this group of people. Now, we started off doing the START course. Some of you might have come across that, the Robin Gamble course, which, again, just bizarre moment. I digress, but you'll probably like it. This is Tommy, who I talked about earlier. And this is his jumper that he bought specifically for his baptism, which says on it, "If found, return to the pub," which kind of shows where we're up to in terms of the beginnings of our discipleship process. But I joined them for the first couple of small group sessions when they were doing the start course, and we had this. It was a really profound, lovely discussion around the first session, which, if you know the course, starts in a fairground and talks about, if you, where are you in life? Are you on like the swing boats? Are you on the dodgems? Are you, and if you're on the dodgems, is that because actually you keep banging into people? Life would be okay if you didn't bang into people, all of that kind of stuff. It's great conversation. We get to the end of it and Tommy's gone really quiet, and I said, "Tommy, you haven't said anything for a while. So what's, and he's normally very vocal. I said, what's up? And he said, "It's that fairground." I said, "What do you mean it's that fairground?" He said, "That's not a Yorkshire fairground." So I said, "Oh, right." He said, I think it must be, I'm wondering if it's Blackpool." "Why would it be Blackpool?" I'm like, I've really got no idea. But again, this is the group who are all on WhatsApp. So, daily I could probably get my WhatsApp group out and tell you what today's issues are in the group. But again, just in that point of transitioning over to other leaders with the wrestling. So we actually do have 2 other pro wrestlers in our church. I mean, you never know how many pro wrestlers you might have in your church. We had 3 at the time, which was kind of an indicator that this might be a direction of travel for us. One of those has now moved back to original church, but I'm still left with 2. And Gareth comes in because he's still part of helping us lead this together. So it's now getting to the point where I don't do quite so much stood up on the stage, but I kind of had to get it going. It's again that sense of you start it off and you become part of the community, as we have. I think that's the only way that we can really help people to be to know that we're authentic. And what I'm not trying to do is impose something on people. So you become part of this community, and then you start up to raise up the leaders from within it. So it is interesting in that Cameron and Katrina, who are there, now are in supporting our community meals, most of our community meals, so they're volunteering. And the biggest highlight of their year so far, other than clearly being baptised and confirmed by Bishop Toby, is that I put them onto the Saturday gathering rota to support and serve the Saturday gathering community. And it's that, the self-esteem that's growing, because now not only do they come along and volunteer, but actually now they're rotated like other people within the Saturday gathering community, and then in interacting with people either on a kind of one-to-one basis or on a one-to-group basis. And that means that I don't get so much time to do some of the fun stuff. And when I hand over Wrestling Church, that'll be, kind of something else. But that's the difference in role, isn't it? It's that movement from, kind of being very in at the beginning, and now you still have to do some of that, but it's releasing that into others.
Back to kind of Paul, kind of his argument with Peter, and kind of if we've not managed as Jews to carry this burden of the law and of circumcision, then why are we going to place it onto these Gentiles if we've not managed to carry it ourselves? Yeah. I just think, what is it that kind of that kind of these contested areas, what are we going to have to let go of?
Yeah, well, it is interesting because our baptism is totally liturgical. Yeah. So, it's we use the simplified version of baptism as we have it in common worship. And for me, that has a huge amount of value. I mean, one, it makes sure that we absolutely. So, and when I do my baptism prep, so my tendency right the way from the beginning of being ordained has been to baptise early. So I'm pretty much on confession of faith and, basic interpretation of what baptism means, and then confirm later, both of which, of course, have had to be agreed with the bishops in advance. But, to use confirmation as the time at which you've done more prep with the person, and then confirming them at that point. And the use of baptism liturgy means that every time I baptise, I use the same liturgy, which means they go through it every time I do it. And it reminds them of their baptism, and it reminds them of their baptism, which of course is exactly what it was meant to be. We've done communion once at Wrestling Church, and again we used authorised Eucharistic prayer, but I simplified it even slightly beyond the simplified version, just to again make it. It's just about making the language accessible. I want these guys to understand. It was really interesting, actually, when we did it. Gareth spoke, I think, and I then talked them through what the Eucharist was all about, again, in very simple language. And when I got to the point where I was about to share the communion, because we had the communion table in the ring and then lifted the elements down in order to, be able to serve people, somebody ran from the back to the front. They were so desperate to receive communion. It was incredible. I was like, okay, just hang on half a second. I need to get out of the ring, which is not easy. So, and again, it's this whole sense of, it should be like that, shouldn't it? Yeah. I mean, it made me just reassess, am I that hungry for Jesus? And he was that hungry for Jesus that he wanted to run. Okay.
What do you use, or how do you do baptism prep and confirmation prep?
So baptism prep, I use the baptism service. So basically the liturgy, and I talk them through, basically step by step, what does this mean, and why am I doing what I'm doing, and what are you promising? Confirmation in this context, we'd use the start course, which is a very, very basic seeker course.
And with the baptism prep, are you preparing people who already come to church, so already listen to Christian teaching, or are they completely fresh?
Depends on which context you're talking about. Okay. So in this context and in Saturday gathering context, they're people who don't come to church, who are making a first-time commitment.
The liturgy in that scenario as well?
Yeah. In both those situations, I would use the authorised liturgy. In 4:30 congregation, it might be slightly different. So it might be somebody. So I've got somebody in my small group who wants to reaffirm baptism vows, has come back into a faith in Jesus, wants to mark that with baptism. So we're baptising her, reaffirming her baptism vows in 2 weeks' time. So with that, I can go into it in more depth, because she probably will be confirmed further down the line. But I want it to be appropriate for her, and her understanding of faith is far different to Tommy's understanding of faith.
And with the baptism prep, is it just one session? Or?
Yeah, usually. Yeah, well, it's usually two, because it's kind of, when they come to me and ask me to be baptised, I talk through what we're going to do. So there needs to be a lot of repetition, because this is all brand new. So, at the point somebody will come and talk to me about being baptised, I'll talk to them about what being baptised means and what they understand baptism to be, so that we've got a kind of mutual understanding. Then I'll do a baptism prep, usually about a week before, so we don't have too much time to forget before we actually do the baptism. And then I'll see them before we do the baptism, and we'll go back through it again. So by the time we get to baptise, we've had kind of 3 shortish sessions, but all of them have been pretty much the same kind of, covered the same kind of ground. So I don't try to do anything like the Creed or Lord's Prayer or anything like that even. It's literally that liturgy. But I do find actually we use the Lord's Prayer obviously in the liturgy context, and that's something that we can then pick up, and quite often do pick up in the confirmation kind of part as we're going through that.
And we make no demands of children when they're baptised as babies, so.
No, we don't. But I do want them to have a good understanding. At least, for me, it tends to be about I'm turning from going this way to I'm turning to go this way. So the whole kind of repentance stuff. And then I'm dying to myself and I'm rising to new life in Jesus. And this is the beginning of a journey. To be honest, if I've got those 3 things kind of nailed, then for me, that's a good basis for me to start the rest of the teaching and the discipleship.
You mentioned giving at one point.
Yeah.
Attitude of the church. Do you, at some point in the discipleship training, do you mention it?
Yes. We do. In both of the contexts of Saturday Gathering and here. We've not quite got as far on it with it as I'd have liked to have done with Saturday Gathering in Bradford. But I often cite the fact that by the time I left Saturday Gathering in Halifax, their giving outstripped the giving in Siddle. And even though you'd got people who were from a much poorer background, we had positioned it as, I think it rightly should be positioned, as part of our discipleship journey. So therefore we think about what we can afford to give to someone else. So it started in Saturday Gathering Bradford, but it's quite limited at the moment. In Wrestling Church, we've done it right from the beginning. So if they're coming to a wrestling performance, they have to pay to come in, it's ticketed. And what we suggest in Wrestling Church is that they might like to give the same amount as they would have given for a ticket, but obviously it's voluntary rather than not. Probably worth saying that wrestling generally is actually quite expensive. So we're just trying to work on the economics of it at the moment. So, it started, it's popular, but we have to pay the wrestlers to wrestle. And it's not like massive amounts of money. You're talking about 30 quid maybe for each wrestler, which brings with it, of course, its own amount of processing of finance and all of that kind of stuff. And then some of the wrestlers who are Christians won't charge for church, but some who are not Christians will charge. So there's still a cost. So we're just trying to work through how that dynamic kind of works, because it kind of has to wash its own face as far as our trustees are concerned in the next little while. So the giving is helpful in all of that as well. Just going back though, when Saturday Gathering originally started in Halifax, I never thought that we would ask people to give, because I knew how very poor people were. But I really felt challenged at one point, I think, by God, that actually I was depriving these guys of, another thing which actually is a builder of self-esteem. Because, if you are able to give, then actually, rather than just always being on receiving, that's a very healthy thing to do. Yeah, John.
Just wanted to say, just to pick up on this point you made quite near the beginning about resourcing churches, starting new Christian communities, network church. May or may not surprise the audience to know that we've done a bit of thinking about that in this diocese, and we've got developing a strategy of resource church and starting new things. So if you want to talk about that over lunch, come and find me. And we can kind of tell you how that works in Sheffield. So these structures and things that you're leaning into in Bradford, and part of your role to pioneer some of these things and being a resource church, we are underway with that in Sheffield Diocese as well. So if you want to know more about that, come and grab me at that lunch and we can talk about it.
Yeah.
I think just following on from that, one of the interesting things you've said, which is probably slightly different to some models of resourcing church, is that you talked about the associate ministers going to these other churches, and that they then have also kind of come to you, so that it's been a two-way relationship.
Yeah, definitely.
I want to. I think that's brilliant. I mean, I think the idea of you offering something to them, but then you saying, but we actually need something, is a good model, and I don't know how much you kind of share that way of working with the rest of the kind of churches in Bradford, because it seems to me as though it's one of the fundamental ways in which we should be working together.
Yeah, I agree. I guess, it came in part from my own attitude towards resourcing churches, first of all, because my experience was when I was at St Mark's Siddle, I wrote to a number of local resource church leaders to ask them to support me. And it was basic things like I would have loved to be able to do a regular worship service where we could have musicians. I mean, we were very good at using IT, and every one of them I got knocked back. And even though I went a number of times, I got knocked back. And I thought, I understand. We, as a resource church, I have loads of paperwork to do. I have loads of targets to reach. There's a whole pile of stuff that goes with it that is, not necessarily very fun to do. But at the same time, I don't want to feel that I am saying no to people that are struggling more than I am, because they don't need to see the stuff that's going on for me, but actually their view of what I have is that I've had a number of millions of pounds invested in me and the church that I lead. And so wherever I can, I'll say yes. And we have tried to make real active roads into how do we better support the people that are around and about us, the clergy that are around and about us. And I've been very fortunate, really. I mean, Bishop Toby and Andy, our Bishop and Archdeacon, they'd done a lot of work before I even arrived on the scenes in terms of gathering people together and talking, as obviously John's going to do, around the whole resourcing church thing and how it fits in, you know, the kind of strategy of the area and the diocese. But I've not really come across much opposition. Now, I'm not naive enough to think that behind my back people aren't saying some stuff, because I'm sure that they are. But I think it becomes much more difficult for people to do that if actually you've said, you know, when you're on leave, if you need cover, come to us. You know, have 3 clergy and a curate usually. I'm very keen that as our curates come in, so Pete, I mean, Pete was a different case really, because he's just an incredibly capable guy. But I was really keen to make sure that he experienced what life was like in normal parish ministry. So, you know, I'd written into his working agreement that at least twice a month he would be in another church, serving another church. And at first that was with, you know, kind of the local vicar, and as he got more experienced and could just pick up common worship and do stuff, then he would cover for holidays. And those things I think are just really, really important in terms of the resource church needs to be a part of what's going on in Bradford. We're not gonna see a massive change in the spiritual temperature of Bradford just with Bradford Resource Church, Fountains Church. If you look at our church, the resourcing churches, and then the support that we're giving to the churches around and about that, then actually that's where the shift in spiritual temperature's going to come. So thankfully we, you know, fixed the safeguarding issue, and as I say, it wasn't a massive one, but it was significant enough for me to phone up the bishop and go, I need to tell you about this. And I need to tell you that if I don't stop soon, I'm going to burn out. And so I need to take some significant time off in order to recuperate. And then I can kind of restart. So I took the whole of August off last year. And really it was that made me kind of go, if I sink, I mean, what I've built is still very fragile. And I totally trust that God would see it through. But also if you think about, you know, some of the other things that I've told you, you know, then for me, it was like, I have to do the best by me, by Dave, my family, and my Fountains family, by making sure that actually I have a better rhythm in life than I've had to this point in time. So I don't know what your diocese kind of thing is around days off, but you know, we get a day off, and then they encourage us to have 2 days every month. And I thought, you know what, that is what I'm going to do. So I'm going to take 2 days off each month, which is where Caravan in Skipsy comes. So I take off on a Thursday, do Thursday community meal, pick up Dave, head to the coast. Rain, shine, snow, whatever, it doesn't really matter. For me, it's the fact that I'm out of the city. And I'm out of the city then until I come back on a Sunday morning, and I pivot now my month around that. And I'm just trying gradually, as we, you know, begin to hand more stuff off, to get to the point where I can do that twice a month, not for 3 days, but at least for 2 days. Because that just gives me time to breathe and to be. And, you know, the other thing that I discovered in the, you know, kind of whirlwind of last year was you just get so busy doing that things dry up, you know. I mean, God's really good. He was still providing me with talks, and he was still doing this and that and the other, but you know, I wasn't living life to the fullness, and probably, you know, the quality of what I was giving out, I knew was not as great as it could be. So I've learned the hard way. I learned most of my lessons the hard way. I read the books and then think, yeah. And and then, but I do know myself well enough to know that was where I was heading. So I put in, you know, kind of firmer boundaries now, and it's good to have, you know, my team are nearly all back together again, and that means that I can create, you know, kind of greater headspace. And, you know, I told you that at the beginning I was doing very little vicaring. I'm doing much more vicaring. So, you know, that's really cool. There are now a number of days where I go home and go, I'm actually doing what I was ordained to do. not just doing all of the stuff that needs to happen in order for this to function. How are we doing time-wise?
Got time for one more, maybe, or two more.
Yeah, sorry, go on.
Thank you for sharing so vulnerably the challenges that you face, and I recognise that when you're involved in pioneering ministry, it is tempting to, in some ways, to overwork and to kind of do too much because you're excited about the way things are developing. My question really is around about where the growth comes from, because I know you're SDF funded, but do you keep an eye on where, if the growth is transference or open church or de-church? Do you have an idea of where the growth's coming from?
Yeah, I do. It's really important for me and for us actually that there's not much transfer growth. So if I come across anybody who's transferring from one church to another, then I'll have a conversation with that person to find out the reasons and the rationale why. And because I really want to keep in good relationship with other leaders, then I will have a conversation with the other leaders about that as well. Having said that, we were fortunate. So we set up Fountains. There were two smaller, like what had been church, house church type things, which had grown over time. I mean, they'd started together, basically both of them the same. They'd started together as young people with a view that they were going to plant a church and it'll be, an amazing church. And it was, and both of them grew. But by the time Fountains was coming on the scene, families had all left. They'd all gone to university and college and all the other things. The root of what was left in the church was very small, but the heart to still be missional was still very much there. And both of those churches decided to come and join Fountains as part of our initial plant. So there's probably about 12 to 15 of those people still left with us. And they've been amazing because they've been such a core to what we've done. So they gave us children's leaders, young people's leaders, a couple of our trustees, and definitely a few wise old bears who've been around the houses a bit that can kind of generally kind of help us, so that provided a really good kind of core. We get quite a number of people coming in from CAP, Christians Against Poverty in the city. So we get people who come in to join CAP for their internship, and they become a part of us. We've seen a lot of de-church people come in who just are not part of a church currently. So recent example, family been to church the last 3 Sundays. Shelby, who's one of my pro wrestlers, had gone to the theatre to watch SpongeBob with little toddler, and she's determined to interrupt today, isn't she? And spoke to her about Fountains. They were de-churched, had been looking for another church for months, had not really done anything about it, a lot of inertia. Turned up, loved Fountains, been here the last 3 weeks. I'm hoping that they're going to plant themselves in with us. We get quite a lot of that. Bradford had, and it was how I came to faith, was actually through the tail end of the Jesus movement in Bradford, and it impacted Bradford quite powerfully. So there's quite a lot of people my kind of age who are not currently in church. And for me, that's another of my kind of mission fields. So yeah, and then new disciples. The new disciples aren't always coming through Wrestling Church and Saturday Gathering. The guys that I was telling you about, they just happen to turn up into church. And at the moment, then the Nigerian community, the international students, that seems to be a way in which we are kind of forging a way into the university.